Welcome to the Sports Turf Scoop. Today the topic that we will be discussing is sports turf injury research. When we think about injury risk in synthetic turf, we tend to think back to the earlier generations of synthetic turf. We think of the horror stories that we've heard about injuries on these previous generations of synthetic turf. For example, the story in Sports Illustrated that appeared in 1993, Wendell Davis for the Chicago Bears, their wide receiver, went up to catch a ball and blew out both his knees, and was primarily blamed on the surface at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. Now the problem is, synthetic turf has evolved quite a bit from these earlier generations. It resembles natural grass more closely than obviously these older generations. However, the perception that injury risk is still greater on synthetic turf remains. So it's important to take a look at the research that more and more is coming out now. Is that perception still reality? Is injury risk higher on synthetic turf than on natural grass? So while what we refer to as third-generation synthetic turf or infield synthetic turf has been around for a number of years now, the first field was installed back in 1997, only in the past several years are we starting to see some studies being released looking at injury risk. And the primary question that these studies are looking at is there a difference in injury risk when playing on synthetic turf versus natural grass? And that's what we're going to be talking about. What are the results of these studies? And before we really get into the results of these studies, let's take a look at how injury risk is measured. And there are a number of different ways that it can be measured. First of all, we have mechanical tests, so things like traction testers or Gmax testers like we see in the picture here. That's one way that we can measure injury risk. Another way is biomechanical tests. That's when we're using human subjects, putting different measurements, taking different measurements from different parts of the body, whether it's a force plate in the ground or different markers and sophisticated camera systems to capture the motion of the person. So biomechanical tests are another way that we can measure injury risk, the forces that are placed on the body. And finally, we have epidemiological tests, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. These are basically surveys that are done of injuries that have occurred during play. Researchers gather the data, apply statistical models to it, and from that we can make conclusions based on the data. Certainly the argument can be made that epidemiological studies are the best way to track injury risk. Here we're dealing with real-world injuries that are happening during real games. We're not trying to simulate injury circumstances as we may do in the other type of tests. But the problem is there's very few of these types of studies. Again, we think back, infield synthetic turf was first installed back in 1997, and only now in the past couple years we're starting to see some of these studies being released. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, it can be difficult to separate what caused an injury. So we look at things like shoe type. We know that certain types of cleat designs, so for instance in this picture we see what we call an edge cleat design. The majority of the cleats are on the outer edge of the shoe. And we know from previous research that a shoe like this, the person wearing it is more predisposed to a knee injury because the foot gets fixated in the turf more easily with this cleat design. So a lot of the times in these studies, the type of footwear the athlete was wearing when an injury occurred is not tracked. Some other things that need to be thought about to make it a little bit more difficult to interpret some of these studies. Was the injury occurring during a contact or non-contact situation? What were the weather conditions? Was the field wet? Was the field dry? Who's recording the data? Is it a certified athletic trainer or is it just a coach? Did the athlete aggravate a previous injury? So all of these things have to go in to these type of studies, and because of that you need a large sample size. In order to apply the appropriate statistical models, the larger the sample size the better. At that point we can actually start to begin to draw out significant conclusions. So again, epidemiological studies are probably the best way to track it, but there are some drawbacks and some things that we need to think about, and that's really the reason there's very few of these types of studies. Now one final thing we want to think about before we get into the results of these studies is how they group the fields together. Basically it's natural grass versus synthetic turf. Now as we know, natural grass, the variation between these fields can be quite high. Are we talking about a high school field that's being compacted by a number of teams on a daily basis, or are we talking about perhaps a stadium like Beaver Stadium here at Penn State that only sees maybe 8 games a year? The problem is with these studies is they lump these two types of fields together just as natural grass. The same goes for synthetic turf. There can be a lot of variation in the quality of a synthetic turf surface. So just another thing to think about, and another reason that we don't really want to pull any one particular finding or focus on one particular study because of these potential inaccuracies. So we look at these studies collectively, and that's what we're going to do. As we have conducted a literature search, looking through the scientific journals, looking specifically for studies that compared injury risk on infield synthetic turf to natural grass, we found 12 of them. And these were in peer-reviewed journals. So basically, other scientists reviewed the work of the authors and deemed it a valid contribution to science. So these are scientifically sound papers. Of those dozen studies, 9 of them have focused on soccer injuries. And these were primarily done in Europe, and they covered a wide demographic, all the way from professionals all the way down to the youth soccer players, as well as male and female players. We also had 2 football studies released, one in Texas looking at high school injuries to high school football players, and the other looking at collegiate football player injuries. And there was also a recently released rugby study. So if we look at these 12 studies together, again, the question that we're asking is, are injuries more common on synthetic turf than on natural grass? So as we take a look at the results from these research papers, we see that no study found a higher overall injury rate on synthetic turf compared to natural grass. So in essence, there was no difference in injury risk whether you're playing on infield synthetic turf or natural grass. In fact, one of the football studies found a total lower overall injury rate on synthetic turf. So again, we think back to those earlier generations of synthetic turf, we did see the research show that injury risk was higher on that type of synthetic turf. But now with today's infield synthetic turf, the results of these 12 studies show no evidence of a higher overall injury risk on synthetic turf compared to natural grass. So as we start to dig a little deeper into some of these studies, we start to see the potential for different types of injuries or different injury patterns depending on which type of surface you play on. Now, of course, sample size and statistics goes a long way in being able to pull out these different types of injury patterns. So the larger studies are able to pull out these different injury patterns better than a small scale study. So for instance, if we look at the high school football study that was done on those players in Texas, we can see the different types of injury patterns. So for example, on synthetic turf, there was a higher incidence of these types of injuries. So we have 0-day time loss injuries, so very minor injuries. There was higher incidence of non-contact injuries and also surface or epidermal injuries, so brush burn types of injuries, and also injuries during high temperatures. Now on the flip side, on natural grass, there were higher incidence of 22-plus day injuries, so more of a major type of injury, head and neural trauma, and also more ligament injuries. Now the authors of this study did do a good job at least trying to characterize the natural turf grass fields some way by showing that most injuries did occur on dry fields. So obviously that gives us a little bit more insight as to what type of injuries are occurring on the grass and potential reasons for those types of injuries. But as you can see, there are different types of injury patterns, and that's really where we need to go. The next step in these injury type of research projects are to see, can we find these different injury patterns, and as a result, can we start to maybe find ways to prevent more injuries? So we've identified and talked about those 12 studies that were published in scientific journals, again, peer-reviewed papers that have appeared in the scientific community. Now some of you may be aware, back in 2010, the NFL Injury and Safety Panel released some results of their study, and they found a higher number of knee and ankle injuries on synthetic turf, so the opposite of what those 12 other studies found. Now the reason we didn't include this study with those 12 other studies is because this study has not been published in any scientific journal to date. Only an abstract is available, and the data is not available to the public, so we cannot really look at the data and really start to see where these conclusions were made. Again, that is as of the summer of 2011. So perhaps as this study goes through the peer review process, if it gets published in a scientific journal, that will certainly add some valuable information to the body of knowledge. And again, we'll be able to compare the results of this study to those other 12 studies and even more as more studies begin to come out. So as we take a step back, look at all those 12 scientific papers, look at the conclusions that were made, we can see that there is really little evidence of any increased injury risk when playing on infield synthetic turf compared to natural grass. Now, of course, all injury circumstances can be different. So what may contribute to an injury in one case may not contribute to it in another. But again, if we look at these studies collectively, no difference in overall injury rate between the two types of surfaces. So as we look towards the future of injury risk research, I think what we're going to start to see is more emphasis on injury patterns. Which type of injuries are more common on one surface than another? And in turn, can we turn that into injury prevention strategies? Can we start to examine the shoes a little bit more closely? Can we start to say, well, this type of shoe design puts the player more at risk on this surface than another? So that's really the ultimate goal where we want to get to. Can we start to prevent injuries from this type of data? Now, if you're interested in looking at the results from any of those 12 published studies, a list of those studies and links to them can be found on our website at ssrc.psu.edu under the Research section. So once again, I'd like to thank you for listening to the latest edition of the Sports Turf Scoop. As always, you can check out the latest news on our website at ssrc.psu.edu and also follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook.